Welcome to another deep dive. You've handed us quite a stack of documents for this one. Congressional testimony, transcripts and emails, news articles, even some text messages, it looks like, all focused on U.S. diplomacy in Ukraine. And well, let's just say there are some unusual activities mixed in.
What I find so fascinating about all this is how these different pieces of information reveal what looks like a shadow diplomacy effort, almost like it was running parallel to the official U.S. policy in Ukraine.
Okay.
So what we're going to do today is we're going to try to unravel this complex narrative and highlight what stands out as particularly noteworthy.
Okay, let's get into it. We've got firsthand accounts from some pretty key players here. Ambassador Yovanovitch, of course, George Kent, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State at the time, and Kurt Volker, the Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. Wait a minute. Are those actual text messages between diplomats?
Yep. Yes, indeed. These primary sources give us an almost unprecedented peek behind the curtain. I mean, you don't usually get this level of insight. And when we combine these with the news articles from the same time period, a really intriguing story starts to unfold.
Okay, I'm hooked already.
Yeah.
One of the most striking things that jumps out at me right away is the removal of Ambassador Yovanovitch.
Yeah, her testimony is really illuminating, I think. It reveals a coordinated campaign to discredit her, with these allegations of disloyalty to President Trump and attempts to obstruct investigations.
But she completely refutes these accusations.
Absolutely. She maintains that she was targeted for upholding anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine, which, sounds good on the surface, but it seems that these efforts were clashing with other interests.
So we see this official U.S. policy supporting these anti-corruption efforts. But then on the other hand, we have these actions seemingly driven by individuals like Rudy Giuliani that appear to contradict that. What does this discrepancy tell us about the forces at play?
That is a key question that we need to really examine. Giuliani emerges as this central figure operating outside of those official diplomatic channels. And he's pushing for investigations into Burisma, the company that Hunter Biden served on the board of,
Right.
and also pushing allegations of Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election. What's particularly significant here is that this was all happening while Yovanovitch was being smeared and ultimately recalled.
It's almost like there's this hidden power dynamic influencing these events, kind of like a shadow diplomacy with its own agenda.
Giuliani's involvement represents a dangerous blurring of personal agendas with official U.S. policy. His actions, while they were sanctioned by the president, they created this shadow diplomatic channel that really undermined the efforts of those career diplomats like Yovanovitch. And this really raises serious questions about the nature of U.S. foreign policy at the time and the potential motivations behind it.
It's definitely concerning to see this disconnect between official policy and these seemingly covert actions. What about those text messages we mentioned? They seem to suggest this pressure campaign for investigations.
They do. In one exchange, Ambassador Sondland, who was the U.S. ambassador to the European Union at the time, he assures Bill Taylor, the chargé d'affaires in Ukraine, that everything is tied up with the investigation.
Tied up, meaning the investigations are connected to what exactly? This raises a lot of questions. What was the ultimate goal of this pressure campaign? And at what cost to U.S.-Ukraine relations?
That gets to the heart of the matter. The sources suggest a possible quid pro quo, investigations in exchange for a White House visit for President Zelenskyy, and maybe even the release of that crucial military aid to Ukraine.
Oh, the aid was actually withheld. That's a significant detail.
Yes, and this becomes a major point of concern in the testimonies. There's widespread confusion and alarm among officials about the decision to freeze nearly $400 million in military aid.
What was the rationale behind such a drastic move?
Yeah.
Especially considering the ongoing conflict with Russia and Ukraine's reliance on that support.
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The sources provide glimpses, but no definitive answers. Some officials, like George Kent, express serious concerns that withholding aid would send a very clear message of weakness to Russia, particularly with that ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine.
Makes sense. Withholding military aid to a country actively fighting Russian-backed separatists could easily be interpreted as the U.S. abandoning Ukraine, which could embolden Russia and jeopardize Ukraine's security.
Precisely. Not only would it impact the immediate conflict, but withholding aid could also signal to other U.S. allies that America's support cannot be relied upon. And this potential damage to U.S. credibility on the world stage adds another layer of complexity to this whole situation.
It's like this domino effect. One decision, seemingly driven by a personal agenda, could have far-reaching consequences. affecting international relations and global perceptions of the U.S. It's unsettling.
It certainly is. And the fact that the aid was eventually released on September 11th only adds to the intrigue, what prompted the hold in the first place,
Yeah.
and what ultimately led to its release. Those are questions that remain unanswered even today.
Okay, so let me just try to recap here.
Right.
We have what appears to be this shadow diplomacy effort led by Giuliani, intense pressure for these specific investigations, and a mysterious hold on crucial military aid. What does all of this mean for Ukraine, especially given their precarious position with Russia?
Well, that's what we'll delve into next. The sources reveal a deeply concerning picture of how these actions strained U.S.-Ukraine relations and cast a shadow of doubt on the reliability of American support. Going through these sources, it really highlights just how much pressure Ukraine was under during this time.
Yeah.
They were caught in this geopolitical tug of war, right?
Right.
Needing U.S. support for their own security, but also feeling the weight of these requests for investigations that went beyond official U.S. policy.
Yeah, it must have been incredibly difficult for Ukrainian officials to navigate that situation. I mean, almost like they were being forced to choose between pleasing the U.S. president and upholding their own national interests.
Yeah, that's a good point. It raises these ethical questions about using a country's vulnerability as leverage in this way, especially when we consider the allegations Giuliani was pushing. I mean, these were serious accusations, but how much evidence was there, really?
Right, let's unpack those a little bit. First, the Burisma and Biden situation. What was the core of Giuliani's claims there?
Well, the allegations centered around then Vice President Biden's push to remove Viktor Shokin, who was Ukraine's top prosecutor back in 2016.
Okay, and why was there pressure to remove Shokin in the first place?
Well, the U.S., along with other international organizations, they viewed Shokin as corrupt and ineffective. They saw him as an obstacle to anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine.
So the push for his removal was part of this broader effort to promote transparency and accountability in Ukraine.
That was the official stance. However, Giuliani and others alleged that Biden had ulterior motives, claiming he was trying to protect his son, Hunter, who was on the board of Burisma at the time.
So they were implying that Biden was using his influence to shield his son from an investigation.
That's the essence of their claim. They argued that Shokin was investigating Burisma and that Biden stepped in to quash the investigation to benefit his son.
That's a serious accusation.
Yeah.
What did the sources say about the validity of this claim?
That's where it gets interesting. The evidence presented in the sources is actually quite mixed. Ambassador Yovanovitch, for instance, testifies that she was unaware of any credible evidence suggesting that Shokin was actively investigating Burisma at the time.
So a key figure directly involved in U.S.-Ukraine relations at the time casts doubt on a central element of the allegation.
Exactly. And George Kent, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, he echoes this sentiment. He stated that he didn't recall any conversations about Shokin investigating Burisma during that push for his removal.
It seems like two prominent figures in the State Department directly contradict this narrative that Giuliani and his allies were pushing.
That's right. Despite their testimonies, Giuliani and others persisted with their claims even after Shokin was removed from office.
It almost makes you wonder if their objective was less about uncovering the truth and more about furthering a particular agenda.
Yeah, it's a possibility that's hard to ignore. And this raises a crucial question. What was the impact of this campaign, regardless of its accuracy, on U.S.-Ukraine relations and Ukraine's own internal stability?
Yeah, it's difficult to imagine that these public accusations, particularly from figures close to the U.S. president, wouldn't have a significant impact on Ukraine's political landscape.
Right. It also puts Ukraine in this really difficult position. They're caught between these internal power struggles in the U.S. while also trying to navigate their own delicate situation with Russia.
Sounds like they were walking a diplomatic tightrope, facing pressure from multiple sides.
Exactly. And to complicate matters further, there's a second major allegation that Giuliani was pushing.
The claim of Ukrainian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election.
Yes, that one. It's a particularly convoluted story. Can you break it down for us a little?
Essentially, the allegation hinges on the idea that Ukrainian officials, potentially working with the Democratic National Committee, were actively trying to sabotage Trump's campaign.
Okay, and what evidence did they present to support this claim?
The specifics were often quite vague, but it involved claims of Ukrainians leaking damaging information about Paul Manafort, Trump's campaign chairman, and actively supporting Hillary Clinton's candidacy.
So they were basically accusing Ukraine of trying to tip the scales of the election in Clinton's favor.
That's the gist of it. However, just like with the Burisma allegations, There seemed to be a lack of solid evidence to back up this claim.
What did the sources we have say about the validity of this Ukrainian interference narrative?
Both Kent and Yovanovitch, in their respective testimonies, stated they were unaware of any evidence supporting the claim that Ukrainian officials interfered in the 2016 election. So again, two central figures in U.S. diplomacy in Ukraine contradict a key narrative being pushed by Giuliani and others close to the president. It's a recurring pattern.
Indeed. And it's worth remembering that the U.S. intelligence community had already concluded that it was Russia, not Ukraine, that interfered in the 2016 election.
That seems like a significant fact to overlook, especially when promoting the idea of Ukrainian interference.
It does raise questions about the motivations behind pushing this particular narrative. Was it a genuine attempt to uncover the truth, or was there something else at play?
Perhaps an attempt to deflect attention from Russian meddling and create a counter-narrative that served a different purpose. It's a thought-provoking question.
It is. And this highlights the power of information, especially in a politically charged environment. How narratives are shaped and disseminated can have a significant impact on public perception and, ultimately, on the course of events.
You're right. It's a reminder that we should always critically evaluate information, especially when it comes to complex geopolitical situations.
Absolutely. We can't take things at face value. We need to consider the sources, the potential biases, and the possible motivations behind the information being presented.
Right. So we've got two major allegations, both lacking substantial evidence, being pushed by individuals with potentially questionable motives. This is getting pretty complex. It's like a political thriller unfolding in real time.
It does have that element of intrigue and suspense. And amidst this tangled web of accusations and agendas, there's another key development we need to examine: the withholding of that military aid to Ukraine.
Right, the nearly $400 million that was frozen. It seemed to come out of nowhere and created a lot of confusion within the U.S. government, according to the sources we know.
Exactly. The testimony paints a picture of chaos and concern among officials who are trying to understand the reason behind this sudden hold on aid that had already been approved by Congress.
It's a fascinating insight into the inner workings of government. We see career diplomats like George Kent scrambling to make sense of a decision that seemed to contradict official U.S. policy and could potentially jeopardize Ukraine's security.
Kent's testimony is particularly revealing in this regard. He expresses his deep concern that withholding the aid would send a clear signal of weakness to Russia, potentially emboldening them to escalate the conflict in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a logical concern. Given the delicate balance of power in the region, it's almost like a high-stakes poker game, and the U.S. suddenly decided to fold their hand.
That's a good analogy. It highlights the strategic importance of that aid. It wasn't just about providing financial assistance. It was about demonstrating U.S. commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and deterring Russian aggression.
So by withholding the aid, the U.S. risked undermining its own strategic interests and potentially destabilizing the region even further.
That's a key takeaway from Kent's testimony and others who expressed similar concerns. It seemed like a reckless move that could have far-reaching consequences.
It's a reminder that foreign policy decisions, even seemingly internal ones, often have ripple effects across the globe. And in this case, those ripples could be felt from Kiev to Moscow and beyond.
Precisely. The withholding of aid wasn't just an isolated incident. It was intricately linked to the pressure campaign for investigations, the shadow diplomacy effort, and the broader question of what was driving U.S. foreign policy in Ukraine at the time.
It's like a tangled knot. You pull on one thread, and it unravels this whole network of connections and consequences. It's fascinating, but also deeply concerning.
That's a great way to put it. And this tangled knot leads us to one of the most controversial figures in this entire saga, Rudy Giuliani.
Right, the former New York City mayor and personal lawyer to President Trump. His role in this whole affair is, well, let's just say unconventional.
To put it mildly, he emerges from the sources as this central player, operating outside of official diplomatic channels and seemingly driving this parallel foreign policy agenda.
It's almost like he was this rogue diplomat, pursuing his own objectives with the backing of the president.
That's a striking image. And it raises serious questions about the lines between personal loyalties, political agendas, and the national interest.
Indeed. His involvement adds another layer of complexity to an already convoluted situation.
It does, and it makes you wonder, what was Giuliani's endgame? What was he hoping to achieve through his actions?
Those are questions we'll explore in more detail as we continue to untangle this web of events. But one thing is clear, Giuliani's role in this Ukraine saga was anything but ordinary. So we've been following these threads, allegations, investigations, and this shattered diplomacy effort that seemed to operate outside the normal channels. And it all kind of culminated in this major political event in the U.S., the impeachment inquiry into President Trump.
Yeah, that's right. It became impossible to ignore what was happening. The whistleblower complaint alleging that President Trump was pressuring Ukraine for personal political gain. I think that really became a turning point.
Can you remind us what the whistleblower specifically alleged?
Sure. The whistleblower, and their identity remains protected to this day, claimed that President Trump had solicited foreign interference in the upcoming 2020 election by pressuring Ukraine to investigate his political rivals, specifically Joe Biden and his son Hunter.
And the basis for these allegations?
Well, the whistleblower's complaint drew on information from multiple sources, including firsthand accounts of that now infamous July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelenskyy of Ukraine.
The one where Trump asks Zelenskyy to do us a favor regarding investigations.
Exactly. And the complaint raised some serious concerns about abuse of power and obstruction of justice. It argued that President Trump was using the weight of his office and potentially U.S. foreign policy for personal gain. And this prompted the House of Representatives to launch a formal impeachment inquiry.
A huge step. This wasn't just political maneuvering. This was a constitutional process being set in motion. What exactly did this impeachment inquiry focus on?
Well, the House Intelligence Committee led the inquiry, and they conducted numerous interviews. They took depositions from key figures like Yovanovitch and Kent, Volker, Sondland, and they gathered evidence to determine whether there was enough to proceed with impeachment charges against President Trump.
It sounds like a very meticulous process, trying to separate fact from fiction in a very politically charged environment. What did they uncover?
Well, the inquiry painted a rather damning picture. It revealed what appeared to be this coordinated effort to pressure Ukraine, orchestrated from the highest levels of the U.S. government, with President Trump himself at the center of it.
And what about, hard evidence? Was there anything concrete to support the allegations made by the whistleblower and presented by the House?
Yes. The inquiry brought to light a significant amount of evidence. There were those incriminating text messages between U.S. diplomats discussing the pressure campaign and the potential quid pro quo involving the investigations and military aid. Then there was the rough transcript of that July 25th call between Trump and Zelenskyy, which corroborated much of what the whistleblower had alleged.
Sounds like a lot of dots were starting to connect, forming a pretty clear picture of what had transpired. What was the final outcome of the impeachment inquiry?
After weeks of public hearings and intense debate, the House of Representatives voted to impeach President Trump on two specific charges: abuse of power and obstruction of Congress.
Wow. Only the third president in U.S. history to be impeached. A truly historic moment.
A significant moment indeed. But it's important to remember that impeachment is just the first step in a two-part process. The Senate then holds a trial to determine whether to remove the president from office.
So what happened in the Senate trial?
Well, the Senate, at the time controlled by Republicans, ultimately acquitted President Trump on both charges. So he remained in office despite the impeachment.
It's interesting that despite all the evidence and the House's decision to impeach, it didn't lead to Trump's removal from office. Why was that?
Well, the Senate trial became incredibly partisan. Very few Republicans were willing to break from their party and vote to convict President Trump. And this outcome, I think, sparked a lot of discussion about the effectiveness of checks and balances in the U.S. political system, the power of partisanship, and the role of public opinion in these high-stakes situations.
Yeah. It makes you think about how these events might have shaped people's perceptions of the government and the political process itself. What about the individuals caught in the middle of all of this? What happened to them?
The consequences varied for those involved. Ambassador Yovanovitch, for instance, was effectively pushed out of her position. Her career as this respected diplomat essentially derailed.
A dedicated public servant, seemingly punished for upholding the values of her profession. What about Rudy Giuliani? Did he face any repercussions?
Well, his reputation definitely took a hit. He became this central figure in the impeachment inquiry, with his actions under intense scrutiny. Although he wasn't charged with any crimes at the time, his legal troubles mounted in the years that followed, stemming from investigations into his business dealings and his role in the events of January 6th.
Seems like the full weight of his actions eventually caught up with him. What about others, like Sondland and Volker, who were deeply involved in these Ukraine dealings.
Both Sondland and Volker resigned from their positions soon after the impeachment inquiry began.
Almost as a way to distance themselves from the controversy.
It's hard to know for sure. Were their resignations an admission of their role in the pressure campaign, or simply a pragmatic move to avoid further scrutiny? Regardless, their departures highlight the personal and professional costs of being entangled in such a high-profile scandal.
It's a stark reminder that even in the world of diplomacy and politics, actions have consequences. So as we wrap up this deep dive into this truly complex and consequential chapter in U.S. foreign policy, what are the key takeaways? What can we learn from this?
Well, this story offers, I think, several valuable, if sobering, lessons. It emphasizes the crucial role of a strong and independent diplomatic corps. Career diplomats need the space to do their jobs effectively, free from undue political pressure or interference.
Makes sense. They're the ones representing U.S. interests abroad, building relationships, navigating these complex situations on the ground.
Exactly. Their expertise and experience are invaluable assets that should be respected and utilized, not undermined or manipulated for personal gain.
What else can we learn from this whole saga?
Well, it underscores the danger of allowing personal agendas to dictate foreign policy. When decisions are driven by political expediency, rather than a clear-eyed assessment of the national interest, the consequences can be incredibly damaging.
It's a powerful reminder that foreign policy isn't a game to be played for personal advantage. It has real-world implications, affecting the lives of people in other countries and the reputation of the U.S. on the global stage.
Precisely. Another key takeaway is the importance of transparency and accountability in government. When things happen in secret, behind closed doors, it creates this environment where abuse of power can thrive.
Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as they say.
That's a good way to put it. We need a government that's open and honest with its citizens, accountable for its actions, and willing to engage in good faith with other nations.
And that includes having a robust and independent media that can hold those in power accountable.
Right. Absolutely. A free press plays a crucial role in a healthy democracy. They act as watchdogs, asking tough questions, investigating potential wrongdoing, and informing the public so they can make informed decisions.
So we've explored a lot of ground here today. Allegations, investigations, impeachment, and the lasting consequences for both individuals and nations. It's been an eye-opening journey.
It has. This deep dive has taken us to the heart of a pivotal moment in recent U.S. history. And it's a reminder of the fragility of democratic institutions, the importance of ethical leadership, and the power of individual actions, both good and bad.
It's been fascinating, albeit somewhat troubling, exploration of the intricacies of power, politics, and diplomacy. And it's definitely left me with a lot to contemplate.
I think that's the best we can hope for with a deep dive like this, to encourage critical thinking, informed discussion, and a continued engagement with the complexities of the world around us.
Well said. Thank you for guiding us through this complex and intriguing story. You've given us a lot to think about.
The pleasure was all mine. And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about how our government works, the better equipped we are to participate in our democracy and hold our leaders accountable.
Couldn't agree more. Until next time, keep diving.